I've got nothing to introduce or kind of witty thing that would get us into what Paul writes next in our study of 1 Timothy in chapter 5 in verse 15, talking about how his recommendation, his urging, his counsel for younger widows is to marry, to have children, is verse 14, to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. And we talked about slander. It's an interesting and broad subject. I've talked about it enough, so I'm going to move on. But in verse 15, wow, it gets real serious real fast. Some have, in fact, already turned away to follow Satan. Yikes. This is not, it doesn't feel to me like Paul is saying, it's just never in your best interest to leave yourself open to the enemy slandering. This is really serious. Some have, in fact, already turned away to follow Satan. Jiminy crickets. What does that look like? Does that mean they've turned away and now they're holding seances at home or having devil worship? Or, well, I suppose it could mean any or all of those things, but more likely, when people turn away and follow Satan, this happens for quite probably a variety of reasons. The two I primarily think of is, one, they have decided they're going to follow Satan, which that is, wow. It happens. And I think it may be one of the saddest outcomes, byproducts of losing track of our relationship to God through Jesus because of grace. Well, the second way is that people begin following Satan and they don't really even know they're following Satan. Is that even possible? Well, here, think about this. What is Satan's primary tool to entice people to follow him? I guess you could almost say, well, that depends on the person, because Satan, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. He tends to individualize his approach to enticing people away from following Christ and toward following him, which I think that's true. I think, though, when you boil it down, and I'll be honest with you, I don't have this deep experience with hundreds of people who have turned away from Christ and begun to follow Satan, except in this. I think the way he entices people, including me, to follow him is to lose sight of the actual objective, the true purpose, the real deal in life, which is to love God. That is what Jesus said. The greatest command was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then the second one is connected to it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So it does come down to love God, love people. That's the primary thing. Satan wants to, he just always finds an appeal Wow. Oh, my allergies are going nuts. My apologies. Anyway, Satan will find his most subtle and often strongest appeal to turn away from what is authentically, truly my purpose in life and turn toward him in some unvirtuous way. Is actually not very hard. He just says, what do you want? That's what's most important. Your happiness. Will it make you happy? Well, if it won't, why would you do that? Okay, now here's another aspect of his kind of how he works. His MO, modus operandi, is he'll do that in innocent kinds of ways. For instance, he will take a truth, and for in my life, it's the truth that when Jesus said that the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, and there's a principle in there that is worthy in that I'm rarely going to be able to love another person if I don't love myself. So there is some relationship between me loving my neighbor and me loving myself. Now, Satan will take that, and all he needs to do is bend it 2 degrees, or even less, to pull it off center. Talked about this before. The sport that I think most reflects God's design in the world is golf. And when you have your club face perpendicular to your target line, and I mean truly perpendicular, at impact, the ball's going to go on that line. I mean, that's just physics. But if your golf club face is 1 degree off perpendicular, one way or the other, at impact, by the time it lands, it could be as much as 30 or 40 yards offline because of that 1 degree of misalignment at impact. Well, okay, here's how that applies. Yes, you really must love yourself in order to love your neighbor. But if that gets 1 degree off at impact, for instance, that thing that you saw online, you should get that for yourself. Now, I know your budget doesn't permit it, but be good to yourself today, right? I mean, you deserve it. And that may be this phrase, you deserve it, is the doorway in my life, and I know of it to be a doorway in lots of people's lives, for us to miss, even by 1 degree, God's actual design. You deserve it. Well, let's think about that phrase. What do I deserve? Well, lots of different ways to look at it. If I put in an honest day's work, I deserve an honest day's pay. Yeah. If we want to go on a quid pro quo basis, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. We both do this and wind up here. I counsel a number of couples who are working off that premise when they come in, that it's a 50-50 thing. You come your halfway, I'll come my halfway, we'll meet in the middle, and that should make it all work. Now, here's the problem. Nobody can accurately assess where 50% is for them. I'm guilty of giving 40% and feeling like I'm giving 55. My wife Debbie is she's, if she thinks she's at 50, then she's at 50. Okay, she is. Well, if you know me and her, you know what I'm talking about. Most 50-50 relationships are somewhere around 40-40. And what does that leave in the middle? It leaves a sizable gap. Well, to get what I deserve in marriage, wow, that's a formula that never works very well, because none of us can perfectly do what we would need to do in order to deserve the marriage we want. What do I deserve? Well, on one hand, because I sin, I deserve punishment. Sin deserves punishment. If I live my life on the basis of what I deserve, I can't do that and live within drinking deeply of experiencing for myself God's grace, because God's grace is not about what I deserve. If it is about what I deserve, then it's not grace. It's something else, but it's not grace. So, all right, Satan tends to pull us away from God's design, and there are times when people know they're turning away from God's design. There are other times when we don't really know that. We just end up not following God's design, but following Satan. That's strong language. That's a horrible idea for anybody who truly loves God, loves Christ, and embraces God's perfect design. Now, Paul is framing this up in the specific context of caring for widows and the responsibility of widows, and even more specifically, young widows. Widows young enough that he urges them to marry, have children, manage their home. Well, man, it's a broader concept. I don't care whether you're a widow. That's not the way I want to say that. I do care if you're a widow. I have compassion for you. That's a hard thing. Whether or not you are a widow, the principle still applies. How horrible is it to discover that you have turned away from God's design and are following Satan? You have to be self-aware. You have to reflect on, who am I truly following? And just my opinion is that if I'm following my own desires, then I am most likely turning away from God's design. If it comes to God's design or my desires, and my desires win, I'm probably following Satan. Boy, that's harsh. What's the answer? The answer is follow God's design. Live by, in, and through His grace. That's the answer. Okay, we'll move on next time on So Care with Stevie Boy, and my allergies will probably still be a problem. I'll see you then.